Good morning. Good morning, dear participants of the conference. You are welcome in our fifth keynote lecture of the EASR conference. I am Urmas Nõmmik, head of the School of Theology and Religious Studies at the very same University of Tartu here. Before we start, I will give a small announcement. Once more, a reminder that there will be the EASR General Assembly today at 4:30 in the afternoon at the lecture theatre at Philosophicum. And I have to remind you that all members of all national societies are really welcome at this EASR assembly, so be there. Now, even though it's already more than one generation, 25 years, from the time Estonia gained its independence from the Soviet Union, we still remember in this country the 50 years of Soviet occupation and dominance. Let me just remind you, you happen to be at the moment in a country which once was part of the Soviet Union, situated only 1,000 kilometers away from Moscow, the former epicenter of all communist and atheist impulses in the world. We are used to define the former Soviet states and countries of the Eastern European bloc as post-Soviet societies, with all their peculiarities and developments, which sometimes are predictable, sometimes unpredictable. The most fascinating and sometimes even frightening is the fact that during the dramatic change in former Soviet bloc, people continued their everyday life. They believed in something or they changed their beliefs. Exactly on these disruptions and continuations, Sonja Luehrmann will focus in the following keynote speech, Institutional Rupture and Personal Continuity, the problem of religion after in post-Soviet Russia. Sonja Luehrmann is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the Simon Fraser University, Canada. She is a specialist in the field of atheism and secularism, Orthodox Christianity, interreligious relations, pedagogy and technologies of ideological transmission, gender and the politics of reproduction, visual and archival methods, history of anthropology. But above all, she is a specialist in the question, how do people cope in the former Soviet bloc with changes in socio-economic and political conditions. She has published many books, but 2 books on Soviet atheism and its effects on post-Soviet religion and historical memory, called Secularism Soviet Style, Teaching Atheism and Religion in a Volga Republic, published 2011, and Religion and Secular Archives, Soviet Atheism and Historical Knowledge, published in 2015. Now I give the floor to Professor Sonja Luehrmann.
Thank you very much, Professor Nõmmik, for this introduction. It's a great honor for me to be here. I still have to figure out these microphones. Can you hear me in the back? My voice tends to fade downward, so if that happens, if somebody from the back could wave at me, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And I wanted to start by thanking the organizing committee of this conference for 5 truly inspiring days of so much food for thought, for thinking collectively about religion from different angles in different ways. It's been really wonderful to be here. So before I start my talk, I wanted to give 2 caveats or 2 warnings. One is that I do have post-Soviet in the title, and the original title I gave the organizers was even more ambitiously entitled Post-Socialist Religion. I am aware, very much being in Estonia, that the different countries that were at some point part of the Soviet Union have taken very different trajectories in the last 25 years. And although I will be referring to a broader literature that is based on research in different post-Soviet countries, I will be speaking mainly from my research, which has been in Russia. But I also hope that for those of you who are familiar with other countries of East Central Europe, of the former Soviet Union, there will be some aspects and some ideas of this research that will be useful for you. And for those of you whose research is in other parts of the world, that you will find some comparative impulses for thinking about secularization and desecularization in this framework. So that was my first warning about the geographic limitations of my knowledge base. My second warning is that I will be speaking about different religious traditions, and sometimes it may sound as if I'm treating them interchangeably. I will be speaking about people who are Orthodox Christians. I will be speaking about people who are members of other Christian denominations, who are members of indigenous religions and of Islam in Russia. And if I do all of this in one talk, it's not that I'm not aware that these religions are very different and have different literatures associated with them, but I am taking really my cue from my research participants in the Volga region, who by and large tend to think of different religions as parallel but separate solutions to similar problems. So again, when it sometimes sounds like these traditions are becoming a bit too easily interchanged, please bear with me on this and understand that it is the influence that a fieldwork environment can have on an anthropologist. So with this, I will also be a good anthropologist and read my paper. As an ethnographer of religion in post-Soviet Russia, one of the things I got used to was to go to slightly out-of-the-way places. A mosque constructed in the park belt surrounding a former factory. The NGO distributing used clothing or working with people with hearing loss out of the basement of a former Orthodox parish school. The Catholic charity housed in the attic above a library that had replaced a pre-revolutionary denominational school. Doing research on religion in early 21st century Russia often meant climbing stairs and getting off the bus in unlikely places, visiting what geographers would call refuse spaces that socialist city planning and its ways of occupying pre-socialist cities had often produced. In thinking about questions of continuity and rupture in the place of religion after the disruption of 70 years of atheism, these spaces and the people who made use of them became guides for thinking about what it means to practice religion after such a major disruption. While the public phase of religious renewal are the gorgeously restored cathedrals and monasteries, the basements, attics, and roughly finished brick buildings, out of which much day-to-day religious work is done, speak to the marginal and tenuous place held by some of that renewal in the lives of Russians as well as in their public institutions. And what you see here on the pictures is, on the one hand, an evangelical church in Nizhny Novgorod constructed in what used to be the sanitary belt, so the green space around one of the factories in the city. and then also from Nizhny Novgorod, a former parish school adjacent to an Orthodox church, where the basement right now has been returned to the church and is occupied by a church-run charity. So these are some marginal spaces that one encounters in field work, as recent protests in cities such as Yekaterinburg and the controversies around St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg have shown. Many Russians may not want religion to take up too much prime space in their cities and their lives. So among Russian citizens, there are disagreements about how much space one wants to give religion. But like the secularized British, who rarely attend church on a Sunday, but appreciate the cultural ambience it lends to their family celebrations, Russians too may step into a church to light a candle or look to a religious charity to help them out when no one else can. Reading through the publications of colleagues, through documents internal to religious organizations, and revisiting my own interview transcripts from 2 different projects, I found that what theologian Katya Tolstaya has named the question of religion after, or indeed living after socialism, was one that stands differently for scholars of religion, for the leaders and hierarchies of post-Soviet religious organizations, and for ordinary members of religious groups. Shifting perspective from time to space, asking not so much, is religion still the same, but where is it located now in people's lives, will, I would like to suggest, help bring these views together. And it hopefully will help us hear some of the ethnographic voices differently. Religion, I will argue, occupies a fairly marginal place in most people's lives during post-Soviet restructuring. So in the terms used in Michael Stausberg's keynote on Wednesday, one might say it has limited domains of use in the lives of most people, if not necessarily across the society as a whole. However, that marginal place of religion is also one of relative freedom, where alternative versions of the Soviet past and alternative resources for living within the post-Soviet present become tangible and imaginable for people. So to give you a brief overview of my talk, I will start with a short quote that will illustrate this idea of religion after and the problem of people that it raises. I will briefly go over some academic perspectives from the ethnography of post-Soviet religion. Then I will take you back to my research in the Volga Region Republic of Mariel in the mid-2000s, and will talk mainly about biographical continuities that I found there among religious activists in relationship to their Soviet past. And then jumping to a more current project, I will talk a little bit about conservative family values activists in this decade, whose work was very much one of trying to distance themselves from the Soviet legacy while also constructing some kind of relationship to it. And then we will have some conclusions, hopefully, about how to place religion in a post-secular context. So the aim of the talk is to think through the idea of living a religious tradition after an interruption, putting academic thinking about these matters into dialogue with what I learned from those who sought to practice reinvented religious traditions. One of the reasons why Russia's religious charities, especially in the provinces, are often found in basements and attics, is that the prime real estate in between is devoted to more secular uses, to housing, for example, or to state-run education and healthcare. Soviet secularization, as I hope to convince you in this talk, has had real consequences for ways of being religious, and also for the ways we might think comparatively about literal and metaphorical spaces that religion takes up in people's lives under conditions of secularization. So now to this question of religion after. As academics, we may find the idea that something substantive has changed in post-Soviet religion relatively unproblematic. Indeed, these changes provide us with opportunities for case studies that are so richly represented at this conference. For that reason, I would like to start from a quote that shows how for those holding responsibility in religious institutions and feeling responsibility for their continued existence, this idea of reinvented or remade religion can feel like a threat to legitimacy and endurance. In the Russian Orthodox Church today, as in other national Orthodox churches, the struggle to claim correct succession after the Soviet period often becomes quite painful, involving property disputes and diplomacy between ecclesial and state entities. In a very thoughtful and carefully archivally based history of the Russian Orthodox Church in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, the priest and historian Georgy Mitrofanov offers a carefully constructed argument for the legitimate succession from Patriarch Tikhon, about whom there was a very enlightening paper this morning by Scott Kenworthy. So Patriarch Tikhon, who died in 1925, and Mitrofanov tries to argue that his successor, the locum tenens in the seat of Patriarch Metropolitan Sergei, was a legitimate part in a line of authority that leads down to the current Patriarch. So Mitrofanov, while trying to construct this argument of legitimacy, also at the same time offers a theological argument for the primacy of the Russian Orthodox Church as an institution that had to survive even as many of its members had abandoned it. So he's trying to construct an ecclesiology that privileges the institution over individual members or individual clergy. Acknowledging the compromises with the Soviet state that the survival required, and the thousands who died in spite of these compromises, Mitrofanov writes. So he's talking about this metropolitan who took on the succession of the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church after the death of Patriarch Tikhon. Metropolitan Sergei understood that the hierarchy did not have anyone to lean on, that the flock had moved away, it was not fulfilling its mission, it was neither taking up the sword nor a rough stick, and was not going to defend its pastors from the nightmare by outside force. But Metropolitan Sergei also understood that the children and grandchildren of these builders of communism would still cry out to God, and he wanted to make sure, as said Patriarch Tikhon, that they would have some place to go. So in this argument, from a post-Soviet history of the Russian Orthodox Church, the survival of the Church as an institution is more important in a way than its connection to a base of lay believers, because the institution is there for future generations. The Church, in this view, is not reinvented, or cannot have been reinvented, but it is there as a permanent offering that other people will eventually fill. This is reminiscent in a way of a view that historian Vera Shevtsov has described as the view of the Orthodox Church as a compound or container that is populated, first of all, by ordained clerics, bishops, and monastics, with the people remaining outside or somewhat incidental to its history. At the same time, and that is the reason why I'm using this quote here as a bit of a critical foil, but also one that I think speaks about very important issues. At the same time, Mitrofanov puts his finger on a generational gap that is very real to people in Russia today, and that affects families as well as religious communities. Most church and mosque goers of today know that there was a time when their parents and grandparents did not attend as regularly. They also know that there was a time when their house of worship was either in disuse, operating under more restricted conditions, or did not yet exist because it is a new construction of the post-Soviet period. And as I hope some of my interview excerpts will show, religious practitioners know that they are not the same people as their parents and grandparents, and perhaps do not cry out to God at the same times or for the same reasons. In a similar way as anthropologist Fenella Cannell describes for British amateur genealogists, religious practice and conversations about it are places where contemporary Russian citizens work out their own relationship with previous and future generations, recognizing older and younger kin as persons, and I'm quoting from this anthropologist's work about British genealogy. So people doing this recognize older and younger kin as persons socially situated within the circumstances of their own times. So now to a few academic discussions about post-Soviet and post-socialist religion. From a secular academic perspective, religious change is seldom a problem per se. We love to discover it and to describe the new and unexpected practices and ideas that it creates. However, there's some debate about the degree to which Soviet secularization was real, usually framed in terms of time rather than space. How much impact did 70 years of Soviet attempts to build a secular life have on citizens? Do we see traces of these attempts in post-Soviet religious practice? Or have they disappeared with the pressures that made it risky to baptize or circumcise a child and favored those who attended secular instead of religious events? In its intensified form, the socialist experiment with forced or accelerated secularization, and I'm using here a term from the German sociologist Monika Wohlrab-Saar, who talks about forcierte Säkularisation in the Eastern Bloc. So this experiment with accelerated secularization speaks to many questions scholars might ask about a modern religion more broadly. What happens when religion becomes a choice, an option among several different options? How does what Charles Taylor calls the possibility of unbelief changes not just what non-religious lives are possible, but also how people who practice a religion see and understand that religion? And then in the Soviet and post-Soviet context, I would argue that we particularly see that religion in modern condition becomes a field where relationships between generations are worked out because its transmission across generations becomes problematic and becomes kind of a site of contention in trying to work things out. So when scholars, and particularly anthropologists, look at religious life in post-socialist Eastern Europe, anthropologists and sociologists, I would have to say, they come down in two camps. There's one group that denies any impact of Soviet practices and sees Soviet secularization itself as something of a failed experiment. The other group argues that socialist societies had a formative influence on their citizens, and this influence did show up in religious settings, so that in a way that the Soviet regime did reach the soul of its people in some way. As an example of the Soviet change deniers or skeptics, I could refer to the book by Paul Froese that was published in 2008, called The Plot Against God. And this book argues that the Soviet secularization experiment, I quote from Froese, essentially shut off religious supply, but failed to undermine the persisting religious demand. So underlying this argument is the idea that religion is an innate need and part of human nature, a perspective shared by many real-time Western observers of Soviet religious life during the Cold War, who, somewhat like Mitrofanov, whose quote we've just seen, looked at the Soviet case from the perspective of responsibility for the institutional survival of their own churches in the West. When Froese concludes that post-Soviet religious resurgence shows the failure of Marxist-Leninists to understand core elements of human nature and human need, he makes a claim about religiosity being a basic element of being human. So in other words, people cry out to God no matter what happens to them or no matter what history they have. And he also makes an argument about the inability of secularist alternatives to reach into core areas of human selves. Scholars who argue for a greater impact of the Soviet period on post-Soviet religious practice, and I would say that these scholars are actually in the majority now, at least of people who do ethnographic work on the post-Soviet setting. So scholars who argue for such a substantive impact often start from the opposite premise, that decades of social change and experimentation did leave their imprint on who people were and how they interacted with the world. And such work has often focused on the mutual transformation of Soviet and religious concepts. For example, research by Justin Kichada in Buryatia and Siberia shows how Buryat shamans accept and appropriate the Soviet prestige of science and indeed argue that shamanism and shamanistic phenomena have a scientific basis. Zhanna Kormina and Sergei Shtirkov, acknowledging how problematic it can sometimes be for post-Soviet religious actors to see their practices as invented, argue that, I quote, the religious enthusiasm of the early 1990s was prepared by a long process of legalization of religion in Soviet time, accomplished through its localization in the sphere of culture. And historian Katrina Kelly has shown in her work on heritage preservation in Leningrad that people who cared about culture occupied a space of privileged marginality in an economy oriented toward industrial productivity, and thus sometimes found themselves in reluctant alliances with those who sought to preserve houses of worship for ritual purposes. In my own research, I've thought about the ongoing relationship between Soviet cultural sphere and religious practice in terms of a class of religious actors I call methodicians, so from the term method, a translation of the Russian methodist. People whose training in Soviet cultural professions gives them expertise in adapting content so as to make it persuasive to others on an intellectual and emotional level. Working in the Middle Volga region in the mid-2000s, for example, I met a Baptist Bible study leader who used to be in charge of political education for her fellow childcare workers, an abistai and teacher of Quranic reading for women in the mosque with a background in trade union amateur theater, and former and current village club directors who had, by the time I met them, become either Orthodox priests or were taking it upon themselves to organize indigenous sacrificial ceremonies. Other scholars have also noted this new kind of religious actor, often partly self-taught and with secular professional formation, and literature calls them variedly educated believers, activists, or following work by Robert Hefner on global Islam, the newly pious. Different as they were, these methodicians had all been trained in the Soviet idea of culture as an instrument of social and political transformation. This idea proved so formative to who they were that they continued to practice it after the collapse of the Soviet state and the widespread disappearance of the infrastructures that had once supported Soviet cultural production. Religion sometimes ends up occupying the physical spaces that once housed Soviet culture, and that had in turn often been expropriated from pre-revolutionary religion. As here in this picture you see a former Orthodox church that still served at the village clubhouse at the time of my fieldwork in Mariel. Religion was also, in the economically tight space of the early 2000s, one of the few social niches where there was material support for the kind of didactic work with people that many of my interlocutors had been trained to do. If post-Soviet religion occupies the spaces of Soviet culture and sometimes finds itself competing with cultural institutions for increasingly marginalized space, it also opens up social imaginaries toward alternative trajectories for imagining good life. For example, in a very detailed and creative ethnography of casual Islam in rural Kyrgyzstan, Julie McBrien shows how to be good Muslims is only a small part of lives, in which dealing with the economic, social, and political dislocations of the post-socialist period takes up much more space. At the same time, being Muslim for these Kyrgyz villagers becomes a crucial part of how they engage with worlds beyond the village, as it drives, for instance, the presence of transnational charities, as well as a burning interest in a particular Brazilian-Moroccan soap opera that was very popular at the time of Julie McBrien's fieldwork. So by and large, the ethnographic study of post-Soviet religion does not suffer from the excessive continuity thinking that anthropologist Joel Robbins has accused the general discipline of anthropology of. Rather, discovering new and unorthodox religious actors is exciting for most ethnographers of post-Soviet religion. On the other hand, there are anxieties about continuity on the part of those representing and speaking for religious institutions. And such anxiety is not limited to the Orthodox Church or to Christian believers. For example, we might think of disputes about the degree to which Central Asian and Caucasus lived Islam conforms to Islamic law, disputes that in many regions fuel distinctions between local, politically loyal, good and trustworthy Islam on the one hand, and transnational, fundamentalist, dangerous and suspicious Islam on the other. Among the Finno-Ugric speaking marii, from whom you are seeing some of these pictures, and with whom I conducted research in the early 2000s, anxieties over legitimacy evoked less fear of violence, but were no less real. One ritual leader, for instance, showed me papers on which he had written prayer texts heard from elders. If he had been a hereditary ritual elder or cart, he explained somewhat apologetically, he would have learned these prayers from youth, and he would never have needed to write them down. But since the hereditary elders in his village had all been killed under Stalin, he had to learn them from scratch, from people who were not his relatives. So being surrounded by the carefully executed handwriting while practicing an orally transmitted religion, or indeed, as the people on the picture on your right are doing, attending a seminar to learn an orally transmitted religion, is also part of this predicament of religion after. Such generational interruptions are an integral part of Soviet secularization and its logic, whose laws and regulations, as Catherine Warner notes, work deliberately to, again, beginning of a quote, break the ability of one generation to transfer to the next the knowledge of religious doctrine, symbolism, and practice. But when we move on from internal and external academic conversations to the personal narratives of those people who fill post-Soviet religious institutions, the question of continuity and disruption becomes more complicated. The concern there is less with institutional legitimacy and more with lost intergenerational connections, experienced in part through a crisis of care. So whenever you try to show a map of Russia, you run into the problem that it's a very big country, and you either have a big map where you cannot see very much, or you have a map that has a weird section of the country where then no one who's looking at it is too sure where things are. So this is a big map taken from Wikipedia of the subjects of the Russian Federation. And the red circle is around the Republic of Marii in the Volga region, which is where this bit of research is from that I'm going to talk to you about. So this is about 800 kilometers east of Moscow. So in my dissertation research on Soviet atheism and post-Soviet religion in the Republic of Marii, I worked predominantly with a particular kind of believer, mainly women and some men in their 50s to 70s, who had a background in Soviet cultural work and were shaped by the cultural certainties of the last Soviet generation. Religion had entered the lives of these former methodicians in the 1990s, and my analysis paid attention to the particular losses of job security, institutional backing, and prestige caused by the collapse of Soviet cultural institutions, leaving a void that religious organizations and ideas were best poised to fill. So not so much an ideological void, but more an institutional void, or a void of how do I use these talents that I have and these skills that I have in this new kind of setting. As a bit of an afterthought in that analysis, I also noticed that religion came up for many of my respondents when they thought about their ability to model the kind of person to future generations that their parents and elders had modeled for them. One of my interviewees, who taught Quranic reading to women at the mosque, located her interest in religion at the moment in her life when she began to think about her mother's passing. So at 40, I already started to think that, for example, my mother was old, and that I can't do anything, I don't know anything, how to pray, which prayers to read, I didn't know anything. When I was 50, I started going to the mosque. And this woman being born in 1942, being 50 coincided both with the early 90s and that period of transition, and also with getting close to pension age, which at the time was 55 for women in Russia. For this and other interviewees, taking up a religious faith coincided with assuming the position of the oldest female member of the family, which often carries particular ritual responsibilities. For these interviewees, an effect of the Soviet era was not just a loss of formal religious expertise, but also a loss of confidence that they could successfully embody the role of informal specialist in the family. A teacher who identified at the same time with the traditional marii religion and with the Orthodox Church told me a story about her father, a convinced atheist, she said, who had nonetheless insisted on treating every meal as a ritual, cutting the bread himself and handing everyone their piece, insisting that they do not exchange it, but eat the piece that they have received. She and her husband had not passed on that sensibility to their own children, she noted. In many of the Christian settings I visited, these anxieties about intergenerational transmission were congealing into quite conservative visions of family. Much of this did not make it into my first book, because I did not quite know how to work with these materials. For example, in a class in an Orthodox Christian school for lay Sisters of Mercy, so a kind of paramedical aid or volunteer that exists within the Orthodox Church, a retired female physician told a group of mainly younger women what had been wrong with the Soviet values she lived by and what should be done about it. In a way that has become quite familiar since then, this woman tied her analysis of the post-Soviet crisis to a critique of Soviet family policy. And this is a long quote, I will read you a part of it. We can observe one terrible consequence of the atheist period in the life of our state, when elderly people, used to living their life in the productive sphere, with material considerations, suddenly they find themselves unprepared in the face of such a problem as old age. And our generation, my generation, is especially influenced and deformed by the atheism of our lives. We built communism, believed in it actively, gave it our best efforts, didn't think about growing spiritually rather than materially. And then she went on to talk about the next generation, what had happened then with her children and the children of people in her generation. And she claims that their children, they also formed such a worldview that rather than participating materially in a parent's life, they look for a way out, which in her narrative led to more elderly people being placed in nursing homes, where the women taking the class that she was teaching were preparing to work as volunteers to help out with these elders. And during the same class, this retired physician was saying that other consequences of what she called trying to build paradise on earth without God included pervasive alcoholism, drug addictions, drunkenness, immorality, and also abortions. And for her, as she was teaching this class about kind of orthodox perspectives to elder care, the answer lay in a combination of a kind of Pavlovian psychology and orthodox teachings about personhood, where even old age gives a person a useful goal to pursue for the higher cognitive reflexes, which is the salvation of the soul. So she says that only the orthodox perspective gives the elderly people this kind of ongoing sense of a purpose and goal in life, and that is why it is important to reintroduce in this situation of crisis. So you will all have recognized that this woman's narrative easily resonates with religious neoconservatism elsewhere in the world. Wherever you're doing your research, you may have heard discourses like this. At the same time, I would also place it alongside these English genealogists interviewed by Fenella Kernel, whom I was quoting earlier, who had varying political commitments, but were driven by a desire to remake kinship relations with the departed and to care for related dead in a way that, in Kernel's analysis, actually kind of blurs the distinction between secular and religious perspectives on social life. As a case in point that there's more going on here than just religious conservatism, I would like to show you a quote from one of the two remaining atheists self-identified atheists, whom I was able to find during my research in Marielle, and where you very much see the same anxiety about intergenerational solidarity reflected. So like most of my respondents, these two former atheist lecturers whom I had the good fortune to interview together remembered the Soviet period as a time when institutionalized and interpersonal care were more secure, while some conventions of intergenerational respect were becoming shaken up. So this is a quote from a 2006 interview with a retired teacher and longtime lecturer for the Knowledge Society, a kind of science popularizing society charged with promoting atheism. And the woman at the time was in her 70s. Hailing from a village and having attended school in the city, which was a common experience for members of the marii intelligentsia, she traced her career in atheist lecturing to a moment in 3rd grade. Having learned in school where thunder and lightning come from, she explained it to the elderly man with whom she and her sister were boarding. And she said, "We boarded in a private apartment. I was in 3rd grade, and my sister in the 4th, and we studied what is lightning, what is a thunderstorm, yes? And our landlord was an old grandfather, and when he came home, we said, 'Grandpa, Diedushka, do you know where lightning comes from?' He said, 'God sends it.' 'What kind of God?' 'It's electricity.' And we began to explain everything to him, to this elderly grandfather. He says in the end, I don't know, who sends the lightning, but you talk well. So this is also, in a way, a story about intergenerational transmission in the other direction. This lecturer's colleague, the lady in her 80s, who participated in the same interview, traced her development into a convinced atheist to a moment when she was already a teacher working to dissuade 2 custodians working in her school from attending Seventh-day Adventist services. And she said, I personally became an atheist because I took an interest in these custodians. And she described how she worked with them and tried to dissuade them while also respecting their point of view. So like many of my respondents in the mid-2000s, regardless of their current religious or non-religious affiliation, memories of moments of interpersonal care made possible at the edges of Soviet institutions stood in contrast to the breakdown of such relationships that they saw in their own time, both between central and peripheral spaces and between younger and older generations. One of these lecturers concluded her comments with the sentence that only money matters now. No one is interested in moral, ethical education. So now we are fast forwarding to a different research project on urban Orthodox family values activism that I conducted in various Russian cities between 2010 and 2016. And where I dealt more directly with ideologically committed activists who struggled very intentionally to bridge generational differences, these kinds of differences that we saw during the earlier project. These were Orthodox Christians in various cities of Central and Volga region Russia who opposed abortion and promoted conservative family values. These activists were people who deliberately sought to give religion a central place in their lives, but also had to contend with the fact that it did not hold that same place in the lives of many compatriots, including their own family members. In this milieu, the idea that secularization impacts family relationships was a staple from global neoconservative discourses, but it also involved a particular critique of the Soviet period and a related narrative of intergenerational misunderstanding. Among this group of activists, I found some similar figures to the methodicians from the Volga region, but I also met younger activists who were trying very sincerely to live out Orthodox values in a more consistent way. In the process, they often found that the older generations, whom conservative discourses told them to look to, were in fact unreliable models, since they had lived by very different values themselves. In an excerpt from an interview with a young couple from the radio cycle, The Lesser Church, which aired on a St. Petersburg Orthodox radio station, Ilya and Olga, an archaeologist and a homemaker who are parents of 3 children, present their approach to Orthodox family life very much in the spirit of experimentation, an experimentation that they were forced into by feeling somewhat cut off from the experience of previous generations. In reality, the wife of this couple interviewed said, if you approach it seriously, this is a big topic for us, and one that is in many ways unknown, the inner life of a family. All of us were put into children's crashes. No one among our acquaintances had families with many children. When I began to think about this, I found that I cannot do this, and that there's no one to learn from. The psychologist I interviewed, who was working in an Orthodox pregnancy crisis center in St. Petersburg, described a similar predicament, talking specifically about the topic of reproductive choices that she interpreted as inadequate or hard to justify. The most interesting thing is when there's a woman of my age or older, her daughter becomes pregnant, and she can easily advise her to have an abortion. She may know that it's considered a sin, so long as it doesn't concern her. So this was, again, a discourse on the, in a way, moral unreliability of these older generations who had lived through the Soviet period. What resulted from these younger activists being presented in a way with the inadequacy of their elders was a certain kind of autodidacticism in people trying to form a family, reaching back to some pre-revolutionary models, so the veneration of the family of the last Tsar falls into this, for example, who somehow now is being made to seem like he was the perfect family father. But there's also a way that these activists are using public and church space for shaping selves and communities in very much this kind of make things up as you go kind of way. For example, the organizer of a center for motherhood and childhood in Kazan, another Volga region city, was a medical student who had come to offer her help to the diocese's department for connections with the healthcare center. And she was a doctoral student in neurology, but was told pretty much when she showed up there, work on abortion, that is important now. She was like, I'm a neurologist. I knew very little about this topic. As a newly minted activist, that young woman learned the orthodox perspective on abortion and the whole moral discourse that goes along with that, at the same time as she practiced such skills as making agreements with healthcare institutions about placing psychologists and donating icons. Activist listservs and other online forums for many of these younger generation activists were spaces to trade advice on the legal parameters of civic activism, how to register a demonstration, or what distance between individuals distributing flyers counted as a single picket, what is known in Russian as an одиночный пикет, and was exempt from getting a permit. So for these younger activists, even as they were observing this very conservative ideology, churches and forums functioned as a space for new knowledge that often went counter to the conventional wisdom that people might have heard from their parents or from Soviet authorities. For example, at a church in Nizhny Novgorod offering regular prayer services for pregnant women, the lectures following the service focused on such questions as the health benefits of breastfeeding and ways to avoid excessive pain medication during labor. The leader and teacher of some of these classes was a professional economist who had learned the content from orthodox psychologists. She described her main aim as fighting old myths that people might have heard from Soviet childbirth education, hinting at the place of these kinds of classes in broader post-socialist landscapes of consumption. She noted that the lectures offered in the church had the same curriculum as private, for-pay birth classes, but were free. Organizations also provided legal administrative assistance to families, for example, helping them apply for benefits they were entitled to, but did not always know how to access. So as has been said about parental activism in Eastern Europe in general, these family-oriented organizations in Russia can be a relatively safe space to express a degree of loyal political dissent and widen the margins of activity for civil society in a context where it is still very narrowly controlled and the boundaries of it are very carefully policed. In this rapidly changing field, there seemed little opportunity to learn from older generations. Rather, younger activists were learning from each other through a loose network of festivals, webinars, and grant programs. In their response to what they also described, like the members of the older generation, as a crisis of social interconnectedness, these younger activists challenged the image of the Russian Orthodox Church as a religious monopoly, more interested in occupying prime space than offering services to people. They also complicate our image of religious or political conservatives because they often find themselves unable to draw on the experiences of the preceding generation, even as their ideology is telling them that that is where they should look to for authority. So, as a brief conclusion, I would like to return to the question of space that I set out from the beginning of this talk, with a kind of place that is reminiscent of, but also differs from, this idea of the church as a container that the quote from the church historian gave us. And this kind of space is the so-called namolinai miesta, or place saturated with prayer, that is also one of the kind of common places of post-Soviet ethnographies of religion. So the namolinai miesta might be a house of worship or sacred site that was open or standing in ruin but accessible during Soviet times. And this place, this kind of place, is often preferred by believers over one that was restored or newly built after 1991, even if the new building or the restored building may be more beautiful, comfortable, and easily accessible, or offer a wider range of services. As a place that people often take pains to get to, and where they imagine and often claim to feel that they have connections with visitors across time, the namolinai miesta encapsulates some of the problems of continuity and disruption discussed in this paper. If religious institutions have survived Soviet secularization, they've done so through a remarkably discontinuous stream of people. And often also through remarkably little organized institutional support. And that is one thing about the namolinai miesta. It requires minimal institutionalized support. We covered in newly built spaces can hold these institutions and their believers together, but they also accentuate that children and grandchildren are not the same as their ancestors. So if the namolinai miesta, this place saturated with prayer, is enough to hold a minimal place for religion in largely secular lives, the content of that place is often, in today's Russia, and I would argue also more broadly maybe in secularized societies, the nexus of generations and the challenging relationship between a society's present, its past, and its future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this fascinating insight into the dynamics of religious life in post-Soviet, in one specific region of post-Soviet societies. There are 15 minutes for discussion, for questions and further ideas, so the floor is open.
Thank you very much for that wonderfully thought-provoking journey through your research. And I found myself reflecting on my own research in the Republic of Moldova in mainly rural contexts. So in relation to the question of space and also in relation to this inadequacy of older generations, I wonder if there's something to be said from your research also around centres and peripheries and the rural-urban divide and perhaps the speed of urbanization. When we look at the kind of conservative orthodox values, I mean, is this primarily an urban phenomena? Because I also sort of reflected on and noticed that in rural context, the adequacy, in fact, of some old generations of women to replace some Soviet structures around traditional healing and this kind of thing. So I just wondered if you have anything to add in relation to centres and periphery and rural urban?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, James. So centers and peripheries were huge, of course, for Soviet development, and they also play a very big role in post-Soviet revival. I mean, the first thing that I would like to say about this is that part of this nostalgia for the Soviet period that my participants were experiencing in the early 2000s, but also to some degree more recently, had to do with the idea that during Soviet times there was more effort to integrate the rural areas. And this could go as far as people condoning or welcoming atheist lectures because they meant that at least somebody went out to the villages. So one Lutheran pastor, Lutheran deacon, for instance, when I told him about my research on atheist lectures in the archives, he said, well, at least in the 1970s, somebody went to the villages, and now no one is going there, and there's nothing to do for people who live there. So yes, centers and peripheries were very important. The degree to which this conservative family values discourse is an urban phenomenon or is getting to the villages. In the activist groups that I encountered were all based in cities. The thing with family values in the villages is that there aren't many families left there because the younger generation is mainly in the cities. So it is maybe a matter of the guide and community leader who welcomed some of us yesterday to the Old Believer Church in a village on Lake Peipsi here in Estonia. Somebody asked her about marriages within the community and, if people marry within the Old Believer faith or if they can marry outside. And she just said, well, there isn't anyone to marry because that younger generation is not here. So that's the situation in most villages now.
Thank you. Yep, there is the further.
Hello, Kim Knott, Lancaster University. I really enjoyed this. I found it very poignant, actually. And I have just come out of a panel on religious transmission and learning, so this was really appropriate. I thought it was very interesting to me and telling when you mentioned the work that has been done in the UK on genealogy. Mm-hmm. In terms of kind of people's desire to reconnect with the past. And I suppose what I'm wondering, given the intergenerational disruptions and so on that you're reflecting upon, whether both through that analogy and maybe also through thinking about the disruptions caused by migration and intergenerational transmission, whether those kind of examples suggest to us that in the future, young people might indeed seek the wisdom of their grandparents or look back to those kind of old chains of memory that actually currently they may feel some disaffection for.
Yes, well, thank you for this question. I think, as I tried to say in the beginning, the way that intergenerational transmission becomes problematic, I think, is definitely an inherent feature of modernity. And in the construction of Soviet culture, I think it was very much reflected upon, and it was to some degree encouraged to create these generational breaks, but there are many other contexts where these breaks are very real and people have various strategies to bridge them. What interested me in kind of rethinking the materials that I collected in this post-Soviet setting was that the agonizing or doubting over this break was actually mutual. So the older generation felt in some way incapable of modeling the kind of elders that they felt their own preceding generations had been. And then the younger activists sometimes wanted to turn to the elders, but then found them incapable of providing the kind of morally consistent advice that these kind of younger, engaged Orthodox wanted from their elders. So there's something going on here that's maybe more than just the modern break between generations, but it also has to do with the loss of authority. I mean, that comes with the fact that a whole state has just collapsed around you, and the life experiences of an older generation are being called into question, or their usages are called into question. Yes, so I mean, context where we might think about that comparatively might be migration, it might be the experience of some indigenous populations around the world. I mean, all of that kind of reaching toward tradition while it is always kind of unreachable. I think it's a very rich field for comparative thinking.
Thank you. The next question.
Thank you, Sonja, for the presentation. I would like to come back to the quotation from Father Georgi Mitrofanov, which you've used to kind of make your argument about the institution, an institutional succession versus people. And I would like just to make you think about the way in which, for example, in the Orthodox Church during the Soviet time, the succession was not necessarily perceived as an institution, as a kind of, you know, from one patriarch to another, but a spiritual succession. And it was structured in a way as a kind of quasi-generational. So in my work on spiritual elders, you know, that comes quite clearly that people, believers, would actually define themselves by this, you know, genealogy and what you call it in anthropology, lineage to some spiritual leaders. You know, some of them were actually those who were repressed during the Soviet time. You know, those who were the you know, real, like, you know, fathers and mothers, and somehow this came also through in this post-Soviet period. So I just wonder, how would you interpret this? And I wonder if it's also the case in other groups, you know, you look at. So there is not so much disruption as a kind of continuity, or is it a constructed continuity? So, well, just to reflect on that.
Yes. Well, I mean, this kind of idea of spiritual succession came out also in the conversation that I had with the marii ritual elder, who was saying that in the normal course of things, basically what he was telling me was that he would not be the elder, but somebody who was from that appropriate family. But the problem was that the appropriate families had all been exterminated, basically. So in the context where I did my research, there was no attempt to replace that by more spiritualized ideas of succession. Instead, people were pretty much owning the fact that, well, you know, I've learned this from the information that I had, and I'm trying to fulfill this role as best I can. But it was definitely a part of this general crisis of spiritual authority, of a general idea that it's not quite clear who you can turn to when you're trying to get advice.
Yeah, thank you. I think we are out of time. Thank you once more very much for this illuminative speech. And thank you all for the discussion, and enjoy your lunch.